October 1962, the height of the Cold War. The United States and Soviet Union are standing on the edge of a nuclear war over the Soviet Union having deployed missiles to Cuba. Eventually, an uneasy resolution was reached. But what if it hadn't been? What if President John F. Kennedy had invaded Cuba? In this alternative history scenario, we'll explore the chilling consequences of that divergence point and how it could have ignited a nuclear holocaust with devastating global implications that still reverberate over 60 years later in the world of 2024. Tensions between the US and the USSR had been escalating ever since the Soviet Union's successful launch of Sputnik in 1957, beating America in the race to space. This was seen as a threat to US technological superiority and national security. In 1959, the Cuban Revolution led by Fidel Castro overthrew the US-backed government and aligned the island nation with the Soviet sphere of influence. Just 90 miles from Florida, Cuba represented an opportunity for the Soviets to gain a strategic foothold in America's backyard. In 1962, US spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missile sites under construction in Cuba, capable of striking much of the continental United States with little warning. This was intolerable to the Kennedy administration. On October 16th, Kennedy convened his advisors and decided to issue an ultimatum: demand the immediate removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba under threat of a full-scale invasion by US forces. A tense standoff ensued as the world teetered on the edge of apocalypse. But in this alternate scenario, rather than pursuing a naval quarantine, President Kennedy makes the fateful decision to launch a preemptive invasion of Cuba to remove the Soviet threat by force. On October 20, 1962, US forces launch a massive amphibious assault on multiple points along the Cuban coastline. Airstrikes and naval bombardment clear the way for Marine and Army units to storm ashore and engage the Cuban military defenses. The invasion is met with ferocious Soviet resistance, and a bitter urban conflict rages across the island nation. Khrushchev denounces the American incursion as an act of war and vows to defend Cuba with the full might of the Soviet arsenal, including tactical nuclear weapons. As US forces start making headway towards the missile sites, a line is crossed. Low-yield nuclear artillery shells are fired at the advancing American troops by Soviet forces desperate to stop the invasion. Kennedy's hand is forced. With nuclear munitions now being deployed by the Soviets on the battlefield, he authorizes the immediate launch of nuclear airstrikes to take out the remaining missile sites on the island. But the escalation quickly spirals out of control. In retaliation for the attack on Cuba, the Soviet Union fires a salvo of intercontinental ballistic missiles at major American cities. New York, Boston, Miami, and Washington D.C. are essentially vaporized in the ensuing nuclear holocaust. Enraged at the devastation wrought on American soil, Kennedy ordered a full-scale strategic nuclear counterstrike against the Soviet Union itself. Waves of bombers are unleashed, raining megatons of atomic fury across the Russian heartland. Within a matter of hours, 25 nuclear weapons have been detonated before some sanity is regained, with world leaders from every nation remaining calling to halt the destruction. The east coast of the United States lies in rubble and is never again inhabitable. Most of the government is evacuated successfully and a new capital is established in Colorado. The Soviet Union takes the brunt of the nuclear devastation and is basically erased from existence. Some of the government escapes to China, but the land that was already so bitterly cold and inhospitable has now turned into the largest wasteland on Earth. The nation collapses, and the few survivors are left to fend for themselves. The once bright future of humanity had burned itself to cinders. From this smouldering, irradiated planetary ruin, a grim new age emerged. What would this world look like today? In the dark decades after the skies burned, new powers arose from the scorched remains of the old world order. China, India, and Brazil managed to avert the worst of the nuclear holocaust by a mixture of geography and prudent civil defense measures. As radiation clouds enveloped North America and Europe, these nations took the mantle of global leadership. However, it was a crumbling, post-apocalyptic planet they inherited. One of their first priorities was addressing the existential threat of the remaining nuclear arsenals held by other states and rogue factions. Under their strategic arm-twisting and economic coercion, an aggressive nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament campaign slowly took shape. The Nuclear Weapons Abolition Coalition, NWAC, was formed in the late 20th century between these emerging superpowers. Pooling their scientific resources and taking extraordinary preventative measures, NWAC teams began methodically locating and dismantling the planet's remaining nuclear stockpiles across the former Soviet states, Europe, the Middle East, and other regions. It was a Herculean, often violent task undertaken with extreme prejudice. The NWAC quickly earned a reputation as a ruthless but necessary force, brutally stamping out any nuclear brinkmanship or terrorist acquisition attempts. By 2012, they had accounted for and dismantled over 90% of the world's nuclear warheads. While disarmament was a vast improvement, it did little to ameliorate the horrific environmental damage already wrought. Here, too, the NWAC partnered with the world's leading scientists and engineers on ambitious environmental rehabilitation and restoration efforts unseen in human history. Radioactive remediation using advanced robot decontaminators and molecular nanobots slowly rendered certain areas habitable again. Aggressive reseeding and reforestation of the barren, irradiated landscapes began reclaiming territory for future generations. Innovative applications of genetic engineering and synthetic biology helped gradually re-establish the tattered remnants of the biosphere's interdependent ecosystems. Fauna and flora once thought extinct were painstakingly regenerated and reintroduced. While pockets of pristine, uncontaminated wilderness still barely existed by 2024, the tireless efforts of the international community have slowly reversed over half a century of compounding environmental devastation. From the charred, radioactive ruins of the early nuclear age, the green shoots of biological recovery have emerged as humanity's lasting resilience asserted itself once more. Thankfully, the nightmarish alternate history we've explored today remains just that, an exploration of a chilling what-if scenario. The catastrophic nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis was ultimately averted in our timeline. However, this exercise has highlighted the sobering fragility of that narrow escape from Armageddon in 1962. It serves as a haunting reminder that a single fateful decision by leaders empowered with the terrible technology of nuclear weapons could have doomed generations to inherit a world of ashen desolation.